Hello. So welcome to our panel discussion with Easton Law, Jillian Chu, Geomon George, and Jonathan Tran. So our earlier sessions today focused on lived theology and trans-Pacific context. We've heard presentations on how particular Asian and Asian American Christian communities think and talk about race, justice, and politics, and how they embody and act on their beliefs about God, humanity, and their place in the world. So these distinctive accounts suggest how things like context, social context, community practices, migration history, and trans-Pacific connections between Asia and Asian America shape Asian American identity, complicate the Black-white racial binary in the US, and challenge and enrich local notions of justice. These accounts also show how Christian faith motivates Asian and Asian American civic engagement and political action. So what we'll do for this hour is give this morning's presenters a chance to interact and engage with one another. And then in the second half of our hour, I invite audience members to please continue submitting and upvoting your questions under the Q&A tab. So right now I'd like to open the floor to Easton, Jillian, Geomon, and Jonathan to say, what's on your mind now after hearing each other's presentations? How would you respond to one another?
So I could start with a question for Dr. Law. I was wondering, you did put a plug saying that you would be able to share your favorite ethnography references with us, and I'd be interested in that for sure. And I was wondering also how you think about Asian Americans in this will be a little complicated, but in the diaspora. So say you're Asian American, but you ain't in America or Asia. How would you think about something like
that? Thanks for that question, Jillian. First, for those that are curious about how to bring together not just on ethnography, but bringing together ethnography and traditional modes of thinking in theology and ethics and these kinds of things, I highly recommend a recent text by Todd Whitmore. Todd Whitmore is a Christian ethicist at the University of Notre Dame, who, not unlike Jonathan Tran, I believe, wasn't trained in ethnography at all, but then took a deep dive into that method. And he did a book called Imitating Christ in Magwi, which is a region in northern Uganda. Imitating Christ in Magwi, published by T&T Clark Press. And this book is amazing to me because he does the hard work of real ethnography, multiple years in the region, but he also weaves theological reflection, history, issues of class, race, economy, colonialism. He weaves this all together in a creative and really powerful text. So that's the one I'm constantly kind of pushing is that text by Todd Whitmore. And regarding what it means to be Asian American and not in Asia or America, it's been hard to do this the past year with everything going on in Hong Kong and China that I care about, but as well as watching things in the United States. And I'm in Switzerland, which is pretty nice. So there's been a lot of survivor's guilt. But I guess the point I'll make here is why I think the trans-Pacific angle on Asian American theology is so important is even though these places are so geographically far away from me, I was often glued to my screen in that mediated way of what was happening. It was still affecting me almost as if I was there, and yet I didn't have a community around to work it out with. And so the closeness of these things is so much closer than before, even if I'm hundreds of miles away from it. So those are just some simple reflections there.
I would also recommend.
I could perhaps add a little bit. Oh, go ahead.
I was just going to say, I would also recommend a volume called Ethnography as Christian Theology and Ethics. It's got a number of voices, including Dr. Whitmore, as well as Luke Brotherton's a number of essays on ethnography and Christianity. Adam, what's his name in the UK, also has a really good essay. But I think the best reading on ethnography is to read ethnographies, and I would highly commend the two that were mentioned earlier this morning.
I was just going to echo Dr. Law's comment on being far away and actually really concerned. And because in June 2019, I was still in St. Andrews, and because in 2014, when the umbrella movement happened, I was in Hong Kong, and seeing things that are happening around me might be surreal, but I could kind of like put it in context. But being very far away and watching the news unfold, because they're not gonna film like just a street with like nothing going on. They're only gonna film like the most intense bits, and so it's very like it made me really distressed just watching the news. And once I was actually in Hong Kong in July, it was fine because like I know things are still happening, but like but the thing is I can kind of see everybody else still living out their lives, and it's much less stressful than being far away and watching things happening.
Yeah, one of the best practices that I have found is the use of senses in ethnography. It is not simply listening, but it is also walking the street, listening, tasting. So it is embodied practice. At the City Seminary of New York, we have a practice called the Pray and Break Bread, where we go to all the boroughs of New York City. New York City has 5 boroughs, and we literally go there and just walk the street and listen to what God is doing. So just walking the street, just imagining, just seeing what are the different stores that are there, who is walking there, who's not walking, what is visible, what is invisible. So I believe we have a PBB or Prayer Break Bread in July, where I invite all of you to join if you can. It is a simple, good practice of how we can use our senses to really understand and discern the community.
You also mentioned, Dr. George, in your presentation about being present in like Facebook and different social media. And I was wondering, like, how do you see like digital ethnography?
It is very important. Pre-COVID, I would not have thought about digital ethnography, but right now in the Zoom world, Air Meet world, right? It is important because before I'm a pastor, they will come to the sanctuary, but now through Zoom, I am invited to their home. I'm actually a guest in their living room or where they maybe. So what does that mean? Where are they sitting? Now, what is the technology, the internet challenges? Again, Jonathan talked about privileges, right? It's also about access and equity that we need to talk about as well in ethnography and in terms of understanding, race, justice, and politics.
My scheduled participant observation was supposed to begin March 15th of 2020. You'll notice the coincidence of the date, or at least on the American side, that's when the pandemic shut everything down. So my observations, which were like 15 hours a week, 50 interviews, et cetera, were almost entirely online. But like Dr. George mentioned, it allowed me to be in spaces that even if I was physically there, would have been difficult. Now, again, this speaks to the hospitality of Redeemer Community Church, as well as a number of people in the Mississippi South. But, I think ethnographers and anthropology and sociology and folks who use that method, this will forever change the way they ask the question of what constitutes ethnography. And that's a good thing. I think that's a good conversation within those guilds.
I just want to echo that. Even in my own methodology, I wanted to be in China and Hong Kong for a longer period of time, but family obligations and things changed that. So half of my interviews were done digitally, and the second half were over the course of three months in on site. And it was interesting to be able to compare the way that worked. Some of the relationships I built up over the internet and how that played out live. And I guess this cycles back to that issue that I even brought up earlier, or Jillian brought up earlier, about the world is so much closer now and yet different. It's just because it's closer doesn't mean it's the same or better or worse, but it's different. And even ethnography has to be worked out differently. How we use the senses digitally has to be worked out differently. And this is a new new chapter in the method and what the church can be doing with it as well.
So Geomon, Easton, Jillian, and Jonathan, from your presentations, you really emphasize the importance of looking at the real lives of Asian and Asian American Christians instead of just making very vague, essentializing claims and reasoning from there. And you also emphasize the importance of bringing together trans-Pacific stories. Can you help us understand concretely, what happens when we don't do this? When we don't look at the real lives of Asian American Christians, when we don't keep in view these trans-Pacific connections. What are some examples of where we've gone wrong in our conversation?
I just published a paper with Political Theology where I offer a kind of sustained critique of what I call whiteness discourse. Whiteness is kind of one of the primary ways through which American anti-racism stages its kind of discursive fight with racism. And I basically say, what I've been saying throughout the conference, that this discourse is half right, half wrong. It's wrong where it assumes that what whiteness is some kind of trans-historical power that determines history without answering to it, that white identity is ongoing, eternal even, and essential. When in reality, white identity is constantly being negotiated. That's partly why it's so violent, exactly because it isn't essential and eternal. But if we don't recognize that, then we can stage the fight of anti-racism against a permanent reality that will only paralyze us, basically. What I say is that ethnography can help us see this, right? So think about the book I mentioned yesterday with Heather McGhee. What she did is she actually went and lived among white people and saw how they negotiate their white identities. I think that's what I was trying to do with the Chinese in Mississippi, as well as the Asian American community in San Francisco. How did these folks actually negotiate their identity? Mary McClintock Fulkerson wrote an ethnography a few years ago where she described a religious community in Durham, North Carolina, that what she said, they needed more critical race theory. They needed to talk more about race. And so I took that theory and assumed that must be the case with the San Francisco church. And what I found was the more they talked about race, the more confusing things got. The abstract theory really didn't help them, right? And so that's what I mean when you write ethnography, you're accountable in a different way. That's why I love it. I mean, it's Christians would just use the language of incarnation. It's answerable because it lives in the world.
And I'll build on what Jonathan has shared in the sense, and this comes from my study in Buddhism, really. I think the greatest challenge or pitfall when you do any type of work, anti-racism work, without ethnographic or without the stories that undergird it, is you reify things. You reify concepts and you think that certain people or certain actions or certain movements are permanently these things, and then you attack and you build your entire construct on how to engage it based on a very reified, and reified just means very permanent, like structured, stable thing. When in reality, they're constantly, all the people that are party to a concept are in fact negotiating it constantly, every day. It is moving, it is changing, it is fluid. And as much as a concept can be helpful, the stories show you that it's just not that simple. And I think that's why so many people resonated with Jillian's presentation. It's because it's easy to talk about democracy, communism, China, Hong Kong in these reified forms. But the minute you get into the stories, they mish and mash in ways that just are much harder to handle, but are real. Ironically, they're more real than a reified concept, if you will. And so that's why it's so important to get the stories. Yeah.
And just to build on that as well, you are really missing God at work. And also you are missing theology. There's a lot of theology going on in the living rooms, at work, between subway stops. So if you're not paying attention, you can really miss out on the creative work and seeing how translation of the gospel is taking place. For example, during COVID-19, the last year, beginning of the March, at City Seminary, we started an initiative called Sustained by the Spirit. You can read some of those stories if you go to cityseminary.ny.org, where we just want to see how churches are responding to COVID-19. As Jonathan was saying, there's a lot of negativity, right? There's a lot of things, fear, anxiety, but we're also looking for the good things. The way the Spirit is working. And we were wonderfully surprised. We shouldn't be surprised because God is in control, but way in which the creativity and the initiatives that the leadership and the lay people are doing. And we would have completely missed it if you had not done that hard work of looking and searching and knocking to see what our church is doing, and I know all of us are doing that at City Seminary. Our initiative is called Sustained by the Spirit.
Yeah, I feel like following up with what Dr. George said, I feel like at the entryway of every ethnography should be written the words, "For those with eyes to see and ears to hear." Speaking of which, one of the things I felt I just felt all three of y'all's panelists, your presentation super powerful. One of the things I was so compelled by Jillian's was when she gave the composite voice to the kind of pro-China voice. The beauty of her presentation was, for a while, I thought it was Jillian saying those things, which shows how much she had the courage to inhabit a different way of looking at the world. I started thinking to myself, wow, does Jillian actually think these kind of scary thoughts? The ability to and the courage to allow yourself to inhabit another way of imagining the world, even one you may find offensive, is this extraordinary work of ethnography. It's both to recognize the problems and deficiencies of a mode of thinking, but also to go with what Dr. George is saying, is to see things that are good and surprising that we might learn from. I was just so like, this is super powerful. Does Jillian actually believe these things? So,
I was reminded of something that I'm not sure if this was something that we talked in private or it was part of your presentation. But I remember how Dr. Law was saying how this being embodying the voice and working with community, and because how we're usually working individually, but actually working in community is also super important. And theologians tend to work on their own, but being grounded in a Christian community where it taps into the voices. And so, and this was actually, I practiced this with two of my dear colleagues and friends. These two different narratives before I presented this here. And so, and we were doing this on Clubhouse because none of us are really good at Clubhouse, and without realizing it, it was like a public room and somebody just stormed in listening to me saying this stuff. And I was like, do they really think I think that? And so, and that was an interesting, and I think but bringing to a different point, I think working in community as theologians is so important, not only within Christian church communities, but also with other theologians, other scholars, other academics, because we're able to create so much more powerful narratives just by doing this together, rather than like shielding on our own and just coming up with things that we think might be right. And so I think not only bringing in the voices of the average person, but also collectively in an academic community.
Yeah, thank you so much. It's such a rich conversation. And I see we have tons of really great questions in the Q&A. So I want to make sure we have time to at least address several of them. And the first question is from Kyle Chen of Princeton Theological Seminary, and he addresses Dr. Tran. Dr. Tran mentioned the Southern Baptist Church's rejection of critical race theory. I've noticed many conservative Christians dismissing anti-racism efforts and CRT wholesale as Marxist and unbiblical. How can we respond for the sake of church unity around anti-racism?
Yeah, I'd love to hear my colleagues answer this too, maybe to save me because it's such a hard question. I mean, I borrow a lot from kind of Marxist anti-ideological thought. That's pretty much all I get from Marxism because I think it's importantly wrong on a lot of things. But I also am, David Chow constantly helps me remember this, but I don't need to go to churches and talk about Marxism. It doesn't help. It may make me sound smart, but it's also going to alienate half the community. I need to take and re-articulate within Christian terms what I think is continuous, but also name what I think is critically different, right? So, but that's also to say I don't want to kowtow, and I think this is the spirit of the first half of the question, is we don't need to kowtow to people who aren't operating in good faith. That is right. I take the point of the Southern Baptists is they're not operating in good faith. They're not really saying I've actually looked at critical race theory. I'm actually a committed anti-racist, and therefore what they're saying is I don't want to have to be bothered by thinking anything different than I have, and maybe at some subconscious level recognizing the privileges of their life that they can issue statements like that. I think that's just nonsense, and I think we should call it out as often as we need to. So
I think you handled that wonderfully. I agree. So.
Well, Mike Karim also asked a question, and this is also for Professor Tran, but anyone can really respond to this too. Can you give us an example of methods or processes where, to quote you, empirical facts, when pressed, become theological?
I'm doing my next project is on a lot of stuff in the science of philosophy of science, specifically evolutionary biology. They, of course, don't talk about God very much, just like when I'm doing empirical studies of, say, systems, economic systems in San Francisco, it's not going to mention God's name. But I think insofar as God inhabits makes possible the material connections of the world, then if you push far enough, and it takes some ability to theologically imagine, you'll see this. But I also said, if you push far enough, you'll see it. But it's also, I said, if you given enough time, I think in eternity, God will show us how all things connect. Because God will say, when those cells work that way, when mitosis works this way, that's me. I engineered that. I did that. So it's just hard to know for sure now. But that's why I said anything that's a fact, qua fact, will eventually yield to theological facts. They'll say something about God. That's what I mean by this world is God's.
And I'd actually like to answer the question as well, because I very much resonated with that statement, Jonathan. And it has a lot to do with the fact, I think, that when you do ethnography with a theological sensibility, you're dealing with this wave upon wave of empirical, sense-based, story research and stories. And for me, I didn't share this thoroughly because the presentation wasn't about my dissertation. But for me, I didn't start out looking to do a dissertation about, trans-Pacific boundaries and spiritual formation. I was pretty much saying, I'm just going to do China and Christians in China. And then suddenly I was surprised by the way that a number of my informants had spent time in the States and how that shaped them, Hong Kong, et cetera, et cetera. But this fact that I kept sort of following like breadcrumbs, right, ultimately led it to this understanding of watching these mainland Chinese Christians negotiate their faith differently when they entered into different places, cultures. The theological truth that came out of that for me was that God wants boundary crossing for the formation of the soul and the spirit. Then this was the sort of the theological insight that it gave, that it opened. And for me, it was the theologizing piece that, crossing boundaries is not an option in the Christian life. If you want to grow as a Christian, it's something that must be done. It's part of sanctification, and that for me was the theological truth that sort of emerged out of the facts of my research, for me anyway.
Yeah, thank you. And Geomon, Jillian, do you want to chime in too, just in your own ethnographic work or work with communities? Where have you connected that to your theological understandings?
As a researcher, it is the sense of discovery, right? So you are open-minded. to be surprised. And to be and the wonder of it, it's a wonderful thing to have, in my opinion. So I often go to see how am I being surprised in this situation. And also in this, I want to say the next generations are leading the way. And we need to have them part of this dialogue and this conversation. So looking at the gatekeepers, right? Who are they? And this Zoom has introduced different layers of gatekeepers. Who were the gatekeepers in our communities pre-COVID are no longer the gatekeepers during Zoom because of the technical challenges and all those things. And it's interesting to see when you go back to post-COVID, right? The shift and the changes that's going to happen. And what does that mean for the church, and how is the church reimagining itself during this time? So this is an exciting time as a researcher, as an ethnographer, as a pastor, as a theologian, to see what God is really doing, and then opening yourself to see what God is really doing, and just record it and share the story. So that not be afraid to share our story, because at least in the Indian American context, the story has been told by the other. So Indian American in the United States over 50 years now, so they have grown into adulthood. So what does that mean, right? There's an old African proverb: until and unless the lion gets to tell its story, the story will always be told by the perspective of the hunter. So the Indian American story has always predominantly been told from the perspective of the other. We have been defined, for example, model community, right? So right now, through ethnographic research and theology that is emerging, we have an opportunity to write our own theology and write our own story and share it and own our story. And what does that mean to be really part of God's story?
Yeah, I echo the sentiments of Dr. George. I'm reminded of Professor Pete Ward from Durham University. He mentioned how when a theologian does qualitative research, it seems like there is an expectation of interdisciplinarity, and there seems to be an expectation that one has to trump another, or at least there's some sort of uncomfortable bedfellow going on. But why is that not the case with other social sciences? Like, say, for example, education. Like, why is education doing qualitative research without thinking, oh, I'm doing this as a interdisciplinary project? And so, and what Dr. George just talked about, being in COVID and using Zoom, and that changes the dynamic. I'm reminded of how in the field, when classes moved from in-person to online, the interactions in the chat box was amazing. But as you know, or you might not, but in a Hong Kong context, students aren't that vocal. Like, they aren't gonna all shout out their questions and comments. And if you ask them, do you have a question? You need to stand there for a good few minutes before somebody reluctantly asks a question. And so, and the same thing with a church. So when church services are moved online, when it's on YouTube, you can see people posting comments. But we're not an African American church. We're a Chinese church. So people in the pulpit won't go when somebody says something in the pulpit, people are not gonna go amen, brother. It's that's never gonna happen. And so watching this kind of dynamics happen in the digital platform, I can see how the digital platform shapes our interactions and the lack thereof, actually. Say, because in China, you're not supposed to evangelize outside of the physical church building. So what happens in COVID, when people can't get out of their actual where they live, and so they can't they can't go, oh, let's do it on Zoom because that's illegal. And so what would that interaction look like then with the lack of that? And so I think it's when we're talking about how being with our community and being theologizing in community, it's not something that we're doing that's different or exotic, but it's so necessary because we need to observe it, because this is actually happening whether or not we're paying attention to it. And so having this conversation is super important.
Yeah, thank you so much. There's a question from Cubum Lee, and he says, I meet many Asian American Christians who are disillusioned and exhausted regarding race, justice, and politics in established churches. Is there a need to think about new congregations and missional movements organized around these kingdom concerns?
This is a tricky one. My tentative answer will be yes, Dr. Lee, that the church has, if you look at the history of the church, even from a social analysis perspective, the church is constantly renewing itself through new movements within it. And that involves, in some ways, leaving old movements, even if you're not, breaking off like Protestants are schisming all the time, but, monastic movements within the Catholic Church. And if we're just talking about the Asian American Church, I do think that this is a time to reconsider what the Asian American Church is. This builds on Jonathan Tran's call at the end of his presentation. Congregations are important, but maybe we need some new types of Asian American congregations, and organizing will, I think, is a good step to imagining what that might be. That's not to say older congregations are no longer part of the story, but churches renew themselves by changing. And yeah, that's my immediate reflection on that.
As I shared earlier, as a researcher, I am excited to see what are the ways in which churches are reimagining in the post-COVID, and rather than asking what it ought to be, I want to listen and I want to see. I think there's already a lot of creativities going on. I'm sure there's a lot of those churches maybe already happening. As an ethnographer, our job is to go and see, and visit different churches, and observe and listen, pay attention to what is already going on. And it is an exciting time to see the new ways in which churches ecclesiology is changing. As I said, gatekeepers may be changing. New leaderships may be evolving. So this is really an exciting time in the life of the church.
I just wanted to say a couple of things about exhaustion. Right, there's different kinds of exhaustion. There's the exhaustion of our brothers and sisters in the trenches, and they're exhausted by George Floyd's killer is convicted, and in the very same moment, another kid is killed. That's exhausting, right? And this is not just what happened last week. This is centuries of exhaustion. There's exhaustion about the way the current conversation is going. I feel exhausted by being in ecclesial and theological spaces where I'm scared to death of making a mistake, of saying the wrong thing. I'm a human being situated in extraordinarily complex realities. Of course I'm going to make a mistake. We're all going to make mistakes. If we format the conversation in one in which we can't make mistakes, where we can't learn to laugh with one another, where we can't say, that was a terrible thing to say. You're still part of us. We forgive you. If we don't have those basic tools of humanity that Christ gave us, that Christ intensified, how are we possibly going to carry this off, right? And so I'm, so there's the exhaustion of the good work, and there's the exhaustion of bad conversations. Now I get why those conversations have gotten bad because of, we need to protect ourselves from certain realities, but we need one that's aerated, open, hospitable, the willingness to kind of extend grace to one another. How do we do that while also claiming for truthfulness and honesty and holding each other accountable? I want to say that that's what Christianity is. When I became a Christian at age, 20 or whatever, the primary claim was, I was in India, realizing there's no way I'm going to be able to carry off this stuff Jesus says about the poor, given the reality of the streets of Calcutta. And the word for me was the passage from Paul, "My grace is sufficient for you," which is something like, Jonathan, I know you're going to blow it constantly. I'm still going to take you in. I think we need spaces like that. At least I know I do. I don't know. I mean, y'all are better human beings than I am, but I think we need spaces like that.
Yeah, thank you. Grace Tan from Brandeis University asks, in terms of next steps, what would partnership and alliance look like between predominantly white, Black, and Asian churches? Even so-called diverse churches are not necessarily sensitive to racial issues, but may be open to working together.
Just to get us started, my guy Greg Lee and my guy Ray Chang recently hosted a conference with the Christian Collaborative with historic Black churches in Chicago. And it began with reckoning with their relationships with one another. Professor George, what you said earlier about the marginalization of South Asian communities within Asian American anti-racism, you're too gracious of a human being to say it explicitly, but I felt convicted that the way I tell the story of Asian America doesn't easily resolve to equally try to tell the story of South Asian folks. So, begin with confession. At least that's what Christ said. It's okay to begin with confession. That's how we get in the door.
Yeah, next two questions are kind of related, and they have to do with limitations of ethnographic work. Christopher Thie asks, there could be some dangers of unhealthy obsession with methodology. Might methods devolve to become totems for conjuring accuracy, reifying even a community for pretext? And Kevin Volrath of PTS also says, I am all for the use of ethnography, and might you speak to the limits of its usefulness, whether for Asian American liberation or for theological questions?
This is a really important question. I just want to emphasize that and then pause to dwell on it some more, but it's a really
in the work of theology, right, you'll have many conversation partners, and ethnography is one of those conversation partners.
I think that the danger in ethnography, or the limitations of ethnography, is that it's primarily a method that's directed toward description, very, very thick description. But if you're going to prescribe something, which I think is often the nature of theology, then you've got a really narrow line to walk. That can be very, very difficult. And I think for me, the limitations of the method are when you have to start making those ethical pronouncements around what you are seeing. And this is where more traditional modes of theology are important. Church history, systematic theology. I'm not going to say those things are not important. I think those have just lost their grounding. But there'll come a point where, after we've gathered all the thick descriptions we can about the world that we're living in, that we're going to have to sort of pivot back into a more systematic way of thinking through these things. And I would note that, Jonathan Tran, given your training, just the way you talk about ethnography and are able to work through it on a philosophical level, that's the kind of stuff I'm talking about, quite honestly, that systematic philosophical work with the ethnographic data and the method. And there's some trickiness to this. The Christian tradition has had its in modern in the modern era, it's back and forth about this too. I see something in the chat about narrative theology and contextual theology, the struggle between the descriptive and the prescriptive. I think that's the big thing that I struggle with when I think.
I think once we think of ethnography as something that can be generalized, that is very dangerous. It's not meant to be that. It's meant to resonate. And so when we think of writing an ethnography, we're not saying how this is applicable everywhere else, but we're wanting those who read it to be able to resonate with the stories that's being told and how that would bounce with their theology and their context and evoke more questions than actually being prescriptive, as Dr. Law said.
Yeah, this is very helpful, and it reminds me of what many of you said earlier about how this is such a dialogical process between you and the informants, and it really also encourages accountability and self-reflexivity, understanding, our own normative values and what has shaped us and our thinking, and being able to interrogate that and be critical about that in conversation with those we are talking to. And I think that's just very important parts of this discipline, this work. So thank you so much for speaking to that. I have a question here. Whoops, it's still, okay, from Xiaobing Li, who asks, I found it difficult for first generation to feel for the second generation's lived experience as Asian Americans. Some first generation Christians dwell on love over justice. How can we fill the intergenerational gap? And I know Dr. George has alluded to some of that in his presentation, so I don't know if you want to take a shot at it.
Among the first generation of Indian Americans, they did not consider themselves as Asian Americans or Indian Americans. They didn't have that category. For them, this was the promised land, and it was a gift. It was a host country, and they will not criticize. And they want the American dream. So because of that, the longing was that they settle down, pass on the faith and the American dream to the next generation, and then possibly they'll go back to India and retire. But what happened was that their children got older, they got married, and they had children. So then the responsibility of grandchildren, say, grandpa, please stay. So that changed the way in which the first generation began to re-examine their understanding, because initially they wanted to go back to India, but now because of grandchildren and knowing that going back to India is totally different than when they left, many of them are choosing to stay in the United States. So they're beginning to see that they are slowly moving from the first seeing themselves as simply as a sojourner, and now saying, what does it mean for me to be in the United States, where I spend most of my time? And this intergenerational conversation is so crucial, especially in the Indian American context. My household, there are 3 generations: my parents, myself, my wife, and my children. And it is amazing to see some of the conversations that are taking place, when you're driving, right? What my parents will not say to me, they open up to my children, right? They're more open. They're more generous in terms of sharing the stories, because they do want to pass on those stories, to the grandchildren. So this intergeneration, whether in the church context or in the family context or the community context, is so crucial. And that is one of the uniqueness that the contribution that Asian Americans can make to the larger communities in the United States.
Yeah, thank you. I see a very interesting question from Shijie Liu of Regent College. And the question is, I'd love to hear more. just from the different panelists selected, how you selected the specific communities that you've studied. What did it look like to go from an initial interest in that community to properly deciding to focus your study on that community? So I think that's a really interesting question, because when we're talking about, I want to learn something about Asian American, like how do you go about selecting a community to study, and what goes into that process?
For me, as a theologian, I wanted to reflect from my community, not for my community, but within my community, which then means that I need to listen to my community, walk with my folks. So I also realized very quickly that not much writings or stories has been shared about Indian American Christians, especially the Pentecostals. There's hardly any writings on the Indian American Pentecostals in the United States, and so I started from my own context and learning to share my story. And then it was that search of, and then finding what are the stories that I have not yet heard. So it is the inquiry, the curiosity, of wanting to learn more about myself, more about my community, and what God is doing here in this community, and what is also want to share with others as well. So it started with my own location.
When I first began thinking about working with the Redeemer Church, I said, and asking their permission for me to enter into their space, including quite protected space, I said, I'm not going to be writing a hagiography, like, presenting you as perfect people. This speaks to their character, and they said, thanks, because that's the only reason we want to invite you. Because if you present us as perfect, as soon as someone walks in our door after having read your book, they're going to be disappointed. So it did mean, and this goes back to several things Easton has said. It's not, for me, it wasn't simply describing what I saw. It was also making normative claims about what I saw. And this meant some points where I make critical assessments of their life, right? So I make quite critical statements, and this is a grace of that church. They allowed me to do this. I make quite critical statements of the discontinuity between their thinking a lot about race and thinking not nearly as much about issues of environment. Why do I find that disappointing? Because I think those are analogous realities. They're analogous realities. They're both about modes of domination and exploitation. It's surprising to me how seldomly anti-racists get that, and how seldomly environmentalists get that. So in telling their story, as I think everyone knows, I say a lot of things I just think are glowing about them. But I also wanted to tell the full story. This is what I meant by the humanity of the project. But it's also the humanity of the ethnographer, because you then have to present the story back to them in fear and trembling. And you realize you feel like you're betraying something. And again, out of their grace, they say, we don't fully agree with this picture, or we do fully agree, but it's your book, and we believe in your work. So it was similar kinds of things with the Mississippi Chinese. And these folks have felt like they've been burned, right? I had mentioned yesterday that one standard interpretation of the Mississippi Chinese was that they became white. This is James Loewen's classic book, The Mississippi Chinese, published by Harvard in 1971. And there's a generation of Chinese Americans in Mississippi who felt burned by that interpretation. That's how they became known. Well, I felt like I was going to rescue them from that interpretation, but I was also going to put them under another searing interpretation in terms of racial capitalism. These are hard decisions you have to make as an ethnographer. I didn't feel like I could only re-articulate what they wanted to say about themselves. I also had to put it within a normative frame. I was just on a panel last week with a bunch of historians at the Organization of American Historians. And, surprise, this is always the conversation historians have, that they're committed within normative projects, just like, Dr. Jane Hong said, context, context, context. One of those contexts is the context of the historian. What is she after? What is she committed to? What does she believe in? And those are negotiations that are fraught and difficult, but necessary. I think Dr. George put it best. That's the wonder of our work. That's the best part of academia, to be surprised, not only by what we find in others, but what we find in ourselves.
And I'll build on what's been shared. My interest in working with Chinese Christians in the Shanghai region was dependent on a lot of personal experience. I spent 4 years in China teaching and doing some work with house churches. And during that time, I built relationships that just brought a lot of questions to mind, right? And then once I started my PhD, they were like, well, I have an opportunity to systematically investigate it, right? But beyond an opportunity to go deeper with relationships I previously had, something that dawned on me while preparing for this conference, again, sort of I'm struggling and working out this autoethnographic turn in my own perspective, is how much I was fascinated by the prospect of seeing Chinese Christian experience among middle-class educated people like me, around a similar age as me, as a sort of alternate universe to what my Christian life could have been. I am a fourth generation Chinese Christian. My great grandmother was an evangelist in the city of Wuhan and in Hubei. And what if, thousands of contingencies, I was in China today and still who I was? I'd still be a Christian. My spiritual life would be so different than it is now as a Chinese American Christian. And there was a deep fascination with looking, again, echoing Jonathan Tran, looking at what could have been similar and what was so different, you know, as a Chinese American studying Chinese Christians. And just the trust and the vulnerability. I think ethnography as a spiritual practice, if you will, is really quite humbling and holy. I mean, they're trusting you, you're trusting them. You're being vulnerable in ways that don't typically happen in your average institutional relationship. And ethnography as a method really challenges both the community and the ethnographer to do that. And I think this is a recent turn, because if you look at early ethnographies, of course, the early ethnographies didn't care, you know, at all about how they were representing the community. They just thought they had it, and did some real bad colonial damage through those ethnographies. But the way that it works today, there's just this holy process, I think, that you go through. And so when I hear, you know, Dr. Jordan, Dr. Tran, Dr. Chu talk about their work and the trust that has to be built, it's a gift and it's a challenge, right?
I started this project thinking that I am a Hong Kong Christian. And so what would make me a faithful Hong Kong Christian? How do I be faithful to my identity as a Hong Konger? How do I be faithful to my identity as a Christian? And so with that very simple idea in mind, I came into doing an ethnography. And the way I approached the communities is through personal connection. So as an insider researcher, I connected with my gatekeepers, and my gatekeepers were able to point me to people who were interested in sharing. And so I can see limitations in that for sure, because obviously this is not just a critique on myself, but also just interviews generally is a very middle class, educated sort of practice, and the voices of the middle class educated comes out pretty prominently, because those who value conducting interviews and those who value research are usually those who have the luxury of time and the money to do that. And so I can see how people I have engaged with from these communities are for sure with similar backgrounds as I would be, because they would value somebody who's doing a research, and they would think their voice is important and there's something that needs to be said about it, and they want to articulate. And so I can see the limitation of that. At the same time, this is not supposed to be an exercise that is to be generalizable about all Christians in Hong Kong. That's not what I'm trying to do. I'm trying to represent a specific voice in Hong Kong. And so hopefully I've been able to do that. And I'm trying to, through these voices that I've been hearing, that to ground where I am and what does it mean to be a Hong Kong Christian, and how does the two identities interact with each other.
I just wanted to slip in. There's another theological ethnographer working in Hong Kong. Her name is Kalita Chu. I also want to lift up her work. And I feel like I would be remiss not to say this, and I hope I'm not making any essentializing claims, but I've noticed that the pioneers oftentimes in ethnographical thinking in its history and in the current turn in theology are women. And we cannot underestimate the power of that. I feel like we just need to get out of the way. And look, people, I'm not saying this to get the floating emoji. So I just, that's something I've observed. So I'm trying to avoid the emojis. I'm not looking at the emojis right now. That's just something I observed.
Yeah, thank you so much. And I just have one final question for the panelists here, because we talked a lot about the importance of particular stories, of not generalizing or prescribing, but then we talked about the tension about how theology sometimes, it is meant to be interventionalist, right? We're trying to disrupt something. We're trying to say, hey, this is how we can be more faithful. This is how we can be more aligned with what we think God might be doing in this world. Here's where we might need to repent. Here's where we might need to change direction. So how do you negotiate that tension, between wanting to say, honor the specific particular aspects of your work and understanding its limitations, but then also understanding its potential and its power to resonate with others and to speak into other situations? Maybe that's too huge of a question to answer in 1 minute, but we can carry this over to the next panel too.
Well, very quickly, I want to affirm the spirit of what Jonathan just said and lift up what Jillian said earlier about resonance. Because when she said it instantly, I was like, that is what I'm struggling with. And she just answered it to some extent, right? Because and this ties to what Reverend Sung Yin was talking about yesterday as well, this offering of a story that has such resonance that there's a humility to it, but you just know there's some truth in there that we're going to keep struggling with and trying to live into. So it's not prescriptive in this robust sort of philosophical oughtness, but it is a story that's offered humbly, that's saying, I think this is what's going on. I think God is doing this. And if it resonates, then clearly we need to keep going with this. And, and in some ways, I think that's how the Spirit moves. So thank you, Jillian, for even taking that, my struggle in that direction. It really was helpful for me.
Yeah, thank you. Well, on that note, let's move on. We have only a half an hour lunch break. Check out the lounges and exhibits. Quickly use the bathroom, and then we'll be back for another panel at 1. Okay, thank you so much, panelists. This was very illuminating and helpful.